Kate Milafalcio. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. And I'm so excited. Welcome to my honored guest, Sara Jordan Heintz, the fabulous author of this wonderful book about Dorothy Kilgallen, her life and her death. And anybody watching this, I'm sure, has been watching the synopsis of the book itself. Welcome, Sara. Thank you very much for being willing to do this.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just so flattered that you've spent so much time with my book. Just a little overwhelmed, too.
I love this book. It's a little obsession books, you know, but this particular story is fascinating. As I was just telling you, it's this really special nexus of true crime and conspiracy. And it overlaps so many hot topics of the whole second half of the last century. Not just the Kennedy assassination, the death of Marilyn Monroe, Sam Shepard. What was the other one that you talked about? Oh, well, we'll get into it. I'll bring it up in a minute. And then, of course, her own death and the resulting intersection of the mystery of her death and the mystery of the Kennedy assassination. And this is intoxicating stuff for somebody who likes a mystery. And you deserve some kind of major award for the amount of research that you did. What is like 20 pages of a bibliography? For God's sake, most people don't read that many books in their whole life.
I just kind of kept a document of everything I found, and just you had to do it as you went.
So let's start, if you don't mind, finding out a little bit about you. If you could introduce yourself to everybody who's watching and tell us about your background, like your family and your education, where you came from.
Sure. I'm in Iowa. I'm born and raised. I'm an only child. And
well, I don't talk to spoiled brats. Sorry.
Okay, bye.
Go ahead.
So yes, I'm an only child, and for many years, my dad Larry and my mom Lily put together a regional magazine called Midwest Today, and that's where I wrote the original article, "Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen," that was published in 2007. So definitely grew up with, publishing, writing, just was second nature to me. And then I went to the University of Iowa in Iowa City, graduated with an undergrad degree in American Studies and History.
You were pretty young when you had that published in that magazine then, weren't you?
Yeah, I began work on that in 2006 when I was 16. And then
Wow.
About a year in the works, just, it was a little beyond what I had gone in, maybe a little naivete on just how big this story was. I felt like Dorothy had been perhaps a little forgotten, certainly by people, younger age, and just really thought this deserved a story. And I thought, why not have it be me to write it?
Yeah, I think you probably were shocked at you felt like you bit off more than you could chew, because this story is insane. It is crazy. It's like an onion. There are so many layers to it. How did you stop from being overwhelmed by the absolute embarrassment of riches of information?
Well, this book definitely I worked on over a period of time. After the article came out, I really didn't have a big plan to do a book or anything. Went to college, began working in the newspaper business, and there have been other books on Dorothy, of course, and just felt like it was kind of time to write my own. And so really at the start of the COVID pandemic, I began doing kind of an outline for the book, and then sort of put it to bed a little bit. It was maybe just about 100 pages at that point before really delving into a lot of the Kennedy stuff. And I felt like there was probably a good market for the Kennedy assassination in terms of who would potentially be interested in the book. So I felt like I needed to spend some time delving into that, kind of juxtaposing with Dorothy's life story. I then also had a baby in August of 2022.
Oh, congratulations. What did you have?
I have a little girl.
Oh, good. I'm glad. We're partial to little girls at our house. Do you mind what you named her? Can you tell me? Or would you rather keep it private?
Her name is Louisa.
Oh, I love that. Did
Yeah,
you name her after maybe a favorite author?
I do love Louisa May Alcott, absolutely. There's also a Louisa County, Iowa, which that's where I first heard the name, so that's kind of wild. But I've loved that name since I was in 6th grade, and when I found out I was having a baby, I just thought, let's do it. So, obviously it took some time there, but really I would say at the start of 2023, I hit it hard again with the manuscript, and the book came out in December of 2023.
Well, you deserve even more praise than baseline, because doing anything with an infant is just ridiculously difficult. So good for you. Why Dorothy Kilgallen? How did you hear? You're too young. How did you hear about her?
Yeah, well, so I really would say my father, who also was very helpful researching different aspects of the book. So my father, Larry, has been a journalist really since he was an early teen. Started his own newspaper as a teenager, radio, just really interested in journalism. So just one night at dinner, he encouraged me to start watching old episodes of What's My Line, at that point airing on the Game Show Network. And just knowing that, I love classic Hollywood, old cinema, I'm just kind of an old soul. So he thought, of course, Sarah would be interested in these game shows. And, he pointed out Dorothy on the panel and said that she had died rather mysteriously. And I thought, okay, I want to know more about her. And then later
Yeah.
I did a Google search and found out that while Dorothy was a longtime New Yorker, she'd actually been born in Chicago. And I felt like, okay, there's my Midwest connection. Let's do a story.
Good idea. Yeah. So I was curious. I couldn't help but notice the parallel between her life and your life. Both of you had fathers in journalism. And was that part of the draw?
I think Dorothy is someone I would love to have known in person. I'm not saying we're identical with our interests or beliefs or anything, but relatable, sure. I mean, you kind of grow up seeing your father in that line of work, find it interesting, want to know more about it. I also have an Irish Catholic background. And of course, being a working mother is probably one of our biggest connections. I mean, I don't have a household staff.
I was just going to say, too bad you don't have the penthouse in the apartment in New York City, but oh well, can't have everything.
Yeah. So those things aside, certainly felt like a bit of a kindred spirit.
Yeah. Oh, she was so sharp, so funny, and so I don't know if astute is the right word, but it was really fun to watch her put two and two together from all the other panelists' questions. She had that laser ability to just hone in on the answers that mattered and the stuff that was just noise and really focus in. She was so clever. And there was something else about her that I want to ask you about, but later on in the conversation. So let me see here a second. Do you have a William Randolph Hearst in your life? Tell me about that. That blew my mind.
As I was writing the book, I would have kind of an outline of stuff I wanted to include. And I thought, what about stuff on Hearst? And I found that column that she wrote, a bit of a personalized obituary, you could say, when Hearst died. And it was just such a treasure trove of information, because you would assume that, well, maybe they wouldn't have met in person since they were on opposite coasts. They maybe would have corresponded in some way, letter, phone, telegram. And it was not. It was just a very silent, kind of would go through editors, go through other staff to curry messages.
Yeah.
And just a very hands-off approach. And certainly Hearst had controversies during his career, and personal life was very tumultuous. So to get that perspective of Dorothy saying she had kind of this omnipresent mentor, was just kind of a wild story.
Yeah, I thought a lot about it when I was putting these questions together, and I couldn't help but wonder. He was so rejected by conservative, traditional, mainstream journalism. They really rejected his kind of flamboyant approach, right? I mean, he liked the gossip, and he was kind of ruthless as well. And they, AP, UP, they all sort of blocked him out. So he started his own network. And I kind of wonder if maybe he identified a little bit with women, because women had such a struggle to make a position for themselves, and especially in journalism in those days. I mean, sending her to the morgue at what was she, 19, 20?
Yeah, some of her first assignments were
Yeah.
definitely those things that maybe people who had tenure said, send the new kid to go cover that.
You could just see them sitting around thinking, the dame, send the kid off to the to the dead bodies, And she fooled them all, because she became really a great true crime reporter.
Yeah, and you could say the roots began there.
Yeah. And I think that she was probably the best person at the time for the work that she did, because of her background. I think it informed her ability to research a crime and cultivate informants, or, witnesses, or whatever you want to call them, sources. Yeah, she was really, and she was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, I mean,
that's incredible.
That's certainly an achievement I wanted to highlight in the book, because I certainly wanted to spend time highlighting, why is this a source you should trust or put any weight into. Certainly why I went into detail on the Dr. Sam Shepard trial, just to show her astuteness. And as I write, this bullshit detector she would have of,
yes,
knowing if something, didn't add up, or wanted to delve deeper, or this is biased, or that.
Here's something really interesting that I think will surprise you a little bit. I don't necessarily believe in a lot of coincidences. I think synchronicity kind of leads us on a path sometimes. I know for me it does. The books that I pick to cover seem to lead up to the next book. It's always really fascinating. So, what book I did a couple of months ago, and when I read in your book, I just went, wow, I was blown away. I did a really good book about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
Oh.
And I could not believe that she was one of the only, or maybe the only, journalist who got to interview Hauptmann, Bruno Hauptmann, who ended up being executed for it. Mm-hmm. She always defended him, didn't believe that he was the guilty party. And then when she was on What's My Line, and she was a panelist who sat next to her as a guest panelist member, but Governor Hoffman of New Jersey, whose career was destroyed by his advocating for Hoffman's innocence. I thought, whoa, you can't make this up. This is unbelievable. Yeah. Really incredible. But her ability to suss out the truth really stands out. So, like I told you, I have about 75 pages of questions for you, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to approach this. So let's talk about her personal life just a little tiny bit. Mm-hmm. So, Irish Catholic girl, she went to a girls' school, right? Was it college? Was it a small girls' school? You can imagine in those days what that must have been like, and yet she and her sister both were powerhouses as they became adults, which fascinates me. So she marries her husband, and it turns out, and I don't think this is not idle gossip. I think he really was at least bisexual, right?
That seemed to be the impression I had.
Yeah. And I wondered, I think she was probably pretty naive. So I'm going to suspect your answer will be no. But I had to wonder, was this a marriage of convenience? Because that was not uncommon at that time.
I didn't have that impression. I definitely think in prior books, Dorothy and Richard's marriage is certainly portrayed kind of in a negative light. And I felt like just through different things I'd read, even when Richard Guest wrote one of her columns, there was a real love and affinity and respect. And, she wouldn't have been the first girl to marry someone who maybe, was interested in relationships outside of marriage or and women. And, you know, we certainly know Dorothy would later step out of her marriage with Johnny Ray. So I think perhaps we felt like maybe it was kind of an even speed.
Yeah, you got the impression that they had an arrangement, not an arranged marriage where they agreed upon it at the very beginning, but it evolved into a situation where he did his thing, she did her thing, but they shared this love of their family and they had a career together on the radio. And I don't think there was animosity. But it sounds like he was probably a pretty tortured soul. Didn't he sort of disintegrate into alcohol? And look at what he did when she died. He fell apart.
Yeah. And I think people who might remember Richard today, he was on the radio. He had that really great broadcaster voice. He was the voice of Boston Blackie. And he was quite a successful restaurant owner, invested in Broadway plays. But I think alcohol began to kind of take hold in his life. And when that
his son said that after his mother died, his father checked out. And the son lost respect for the dad because of that. And if, you know, of course, a kid would feel abandoned and the grief and the loss. I'm not judging. I'm just saying his struggles overtook his life. But interesting relationship, especially for the time, because I get the feeling she didn't try very hard to hide it. I think he did a little bit. And he had an apartment and a kind of a long-term relationship with another man somewhere in New Jersey. But they maintained their family life in New York City. And she had a long-term boyfriend. So another interesting thing you mentioned was they went on a honeymoon to Cuba that was paid for by the gambling mob, basically.
Yeah.
How did that play into later when she was researching for the investigating the Kennedy thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely odd that she honeymooned there. I don't know if that's where she got her interest in Cuba. Certainly, she was very vocally critical of Fidel Castro. That was a big component of her writing. And then, as I mentioned in my research, I'd kind of put together that Florence Pritchard Smith, one of her longtime friends who also died kind of under weird circumstances, was also a journalist. Her husband for a time had been an ambassador to Cuba. And, you know, just wondering if perhaps they were some of her insider sources.
Oh, interesting. Well, you know, I think we forget now. I remember because I'm older, but Cuba was a hot vacation spot. It was really sort of the sophisticated, popular place to go. If you had a little money, it was a great place to go and sit in the sun. And what you see that Miami has become all comes from the Cuban influence, the expatriates, but also, you know, it's close to Cuba and it kind of filtered up from Cuba to Miami. We tend to forget because it's been so closed off for so long to us. So this is a little bit off the topic of her marriage, but it is about her family. I'm really curious if you have an opinion. What happened to her 14-year-old son when he disappeared for 2 days? Would you know what that was about? Because there really doesn't seem to be a lot of information.
Yeah, you know, I honestly included that tidbit because when I was researching Richard Colmar's early years, he had that tendency to run away from home. And I wondered if there was just a little bit of a father-son predisposition for stress management, coping with big emotions that leave. And obviously with Dorothy being high profile, it made the news. It was probably a bit embarrassing to have that sprawled all over newspapers.
Well, that's a teenager's job. Prepare yourself, brace yourself. Their job is to torture you and embarrass you for as long as they possibly can. It's hard to raise teenagers, and I think it's hard to be the child of somebody who's acclaimed and gadding about a lot. I mean, let's face it, they were gone a lot, and I'm sure that must have created all sorts of interesting interpersonal dynamics. But I just wondered if you had any inside gossip, like where did he go? Was he just hanging out with friends? And teenage rebellion, or was there something more nefarious?
Yeah, I don't know, but I feel like Dorothy and that eldest son, Richard Jr., did not have a really close relationship as he
Yeah.
got older. So, that could have just been kind of some foreshadowing for the split to come.
Yeah, personal dynamics. So one of the interesting relationships in her life, I thought, was Hoover, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, because they agreed on so many interesting things and then disagreed. And he was in charge of ostensibly the surveillance that went on in her life before she died. And she and he agreed on, for example, the blacklist of the McCarthy hearings. And I that sort of surprised me. They agreed on the Japanese internment being not okay, not constitutional, and a stain on the American people. And they agreed that the Warren Report was baloney. And they didn't like the CIA. And Johnson, they agreed on Johnson. Like, I think it was Hoover who said that he consorted with hoodlums. I could be wrong about who said that, but that's a quote from the book. What do you make of their unpredictable relationship?
Well, I think Dorothy was definitely an equal opportunity critic. If she felt like she could agree with you on this, maybe there was another topic that she would take you to task for. But Hoover certainly has a complex legacy, as you discovered with the Kennedy assassination. Investigating different plots on Kennedy.
Yeah.
And yet we know about COINTELPRO and all of that surveillance of different activist groups. Native American rights, Black Panthers, all of that. So I think if Dorothy agreed with you about something, she was not shy to voice that. But then I think the next day, if something was worthy of criticism, there she was.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think that's part of her attraction for me, is her ability to just speak her mind. She apparently just didn't care. She spoke her mind, and I love that about her. And then speaking of speaking your mind, she had all these different feuds with people, and my favorite one was her feud with Frank Sinatra. Hilarious. He's a piece of work. Well, R.I.P. was a piece of work, but I could just imagine the two of them going at each other and the terrible things he said about her. Oh my God. The story that comes to mind is she was in some nightclub or restaurant with sunglasses on, and he walked by. She had a glass in her hand, and he dropped a coin in her glass, like, she was asking for money. Just a nasty piece of work. Just personal opinion, allegedly. So, and then Jack Parr, who was all mad at him, called him theatrical. It was performative anger on his part to march off his set. And then pro Billy Graham. Come on. That just blows my mind. It seems somewhat inconsistent. What do you think?
Well, I definitely approached this book through a feminist lens, because I felt like some of the bigger feuds anyway were always with men. And she might criticize their career, political positions, and they'd criticize her appearance.
Yeah.
Would go after that. I mean, even, briefly that Johnny Carson feud of comparing her to a circus clown, and, a mistake her parents made when she was born. Just, I don't know, kind of petty. I mean, I think you have to be a bit thick-skinned to be in the entertainment business, and some of these men seem very intimidated by her.
Well, and her job, let's face it, I mean, this column that she put out every day was a gossip column. What did you expect? When you put yourself out in the public eye, you have to know that you're going to be looked at through a magnifying glass, and people are going to have opinions. She didn't like Sinatra, I got the impression, because of his adultery, the way he treated his wife. Mm-hmm. So like you said, through a feminist point of view. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so this is the little topic I mentioned earlier I wanted to bring up, that I found really interesting. You kind of hinted at it. I don't think you really elaborated on it a lot, and that's why I'm going to pick your brain right now. You mentioned that when she was on What's My Line, she and her friend would make an agreement because panelists were blindfolded. Her friend would be watching the show and would try to telepathically communicate to her who this surprise guest was. And they claim that it worked, and she seemed to be pretty accurate a lot of the time. And then she made some statements. In the book, you mentioned several things that she said. That the day of JFK's inauguration, she couldn't get Lincoln out of her mind. She just kept thinking of Lincoln the whole time. I thought that was really interesting for obvious reasons. And then she predicted that Jackie Kennedy would be a fashion icon, which is interesting because when they were first together, Jackie was in the background. She was kind of soft. Well, she had this little baby voice. She was soft spoken. She was retiring, a bit shy. She didn't have a real an extroverted personality. It's not obvious at the beginning that this would be a woman who would become such a monumental icon. Thought that was prescient of Kilgallen to see that. So, do you think she was psychic?
Gosh, I don't know if she would believe in that. I don't know what she would think.
Well, you don't have to believe in it.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I think she was just very street smart, and I think she covered so many different types of stories in her career that I think that's where she just kind of had that memory bank of, I've seen this before. I think this is maybe, just having that foresight.
Joking aside, she was well educated. She was very well informed, and she was really good judge of character and personality. That goes a long way. But where do you cross the line to psychic ability? It's just a gift like anything else. So who knows, One topic in the book that you actually really delved into fairly deeply, and I don't know if you want to be the person to just go ahead and sort of summarize it, was the death of Marilyn Monroe. I'm thinking, after reading your book, I'm thinking I'm going to have to just do a book on the death of Marilyn Monroe. It is such a topic.
Yes. Absolutely.
So what can you, how can you elaborate on that for us?
Well, I think a lot of people know the basic outline of Marilyn. Marilyn's death came, just about 48 hours after a newspaper column talked about, Marilyn's career is on the upswing, her personal life. She's dating a man more famous than Joe DiMaggio was, and just don't count her out. And that column was written by Dorothy. So, and of course, syndicated. This would appear maybe with about a day delay, on the opposite coast, typically. And just the things she was writing about, like kind of about the Count Neva Lodge, those photos that were allegedly taken of Marilyn in kind of compromising positions, just who that source could have been feeding her that information. It was not all accurate. It was not necessarily a fair assessment of what was going on in Marilyn's life. And it certainly begs the question of, was Marilyn murdered because of some of these things coming out in the press?
So I'm jumping to conclusions here. You think that she was murdered? Because I'm convinced she was. And I'm not one of these, oh, Marilyn, I don't have the Andy Warhol print on the wall, Yeah. But I've always felt that it was a very questionable story about what happened to her. I've heard, and I don't remember where I heard this, so this is alleged, that she was held down and given a fatal dose of something rectally. So there were no marks, no injection marks anywhere on her body, nothing in her stomach that they could have attributed her death, to which they could have attributed her death, but that she was an astute businesswoman. She wasn't nearly as completely unstable as people like to say she was.
Absolutely.
That there was quite a bit of acting that was going on in her part to protect her private life from her public persona. And I think to fool the men in the business and the industry that she was, you know, to make her career as much as she could without the interference of misogyny, which was pervasive, right? So, long story short, Dorothy kind of blamed herself. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, when she found out that Marilyn had died, I mean, she was really kind of physically ill, and fortunately, they had taped the episode "What's My Line," so she did not have to appear that Sunday night on camera. And kind of as I have in that chapter, the tone of Dorothy's columns on Marilyn really took a shift. At first they were very, well, her whole life was a suicide note, and what do you expect, with this type of personality? And then she kind of likened it to a Perry Mason episode of, all these weird people in Marilyn's life, and we'll never know the truth, and it's a hush hush job. And so that was maybe one of the first high profile deaths that Dorothy was very vocal about,
Yeah.
the year before Kennedy.
Yeah, the implication that the housekeeper was really kind of a plant to keep an eye and to get information, and the whole story just stinks. Can you recommend what you would consider to be a really good book? Because there's so much out there. I've been looking, and it's hard to discern what's going to be just gossip and what's going to actually have up-to-date factual information.
Honestly, Helen, my father, Larry Jordan, is working on a book on Marilyn right now. Yeah, it's called
Oh my God.
Monroe. Yeah, and it's really grown, maybe about 700 pages in length. Just a big project. And he was able to interview people in kind of Marilyn's closest circle, people that you wouldn't maybe even know their names to date, just people she had befriended. And so yeah, I definitely would recommend that. It's due out, I think, about this summer.
What's the name of it again? I didn't hear you.
Yeah, it's called The Real Marilyn Monroe.
And his full name?
Larry Jordan.
You tell your father for me that I'm going to get the book when it comes out. And if he'd come and I'll cover it if he'll come and talk with us about it, because I know this is a topic that people are endlessly fascinated by.
Yeah.
And if the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, then he's probably a pretty good researcher too.
Absolutely. And I think the book was definitely motivated by just so much misinformation about Marilyn, especially people who really like to turn her into a martyr and this very pathetic figure. And I think this book goes a long way in creating a more multidimensional human being. And of course, delving into her death.
Well, people try to make her mentally ill, unstable, the tragic result of a troubled mother, promiscuous. Her picker was broken. She went through this string of men. And, the narrative around her, I've always felt was largely fiction. There's got to be a real person in there somewhere. So I'm excited. He's doing this because I think I have a feeling it'll be a good book. So let's see here. Dorothy and we haven't even gotten to her death yet. This is a crazy, deep book full of information. It's just so her relationship with presidents. I would just make a quick comment on the fact that she wasn't averse to getting in touch with Ike Eisenhower or LBJ or any of them and just telling them where they'd gone wrong when she was right. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
She wrote to Eisenhower and said, "Hey, this position you're now taking on Castro, I talked about it in my column 2 years ago. Where have you been, buddy?" I love it. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. And she called LBJ out, and she did it after the assassination, which just feels like thin ice to me. It felt like really a risky thing. She was brave. I think she was really brave.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely pushing the envelope whenever she needed
So
to.
here's the question. So we're going to talk a little bit here about her and the investigation into Kennedy's assassination. And we could discuss this for months. I mean, there's been so much written about it. And here we are, 2024, we're still talking about it. When it happened, I was in the 4th grade. And I remember, like it was yesterday, I have a theory, my opinion, is that the assassination of John Kennedy was the biggest trauma in the United States of the modern time, eclipsing 9/11. And I know that won't be a popular opinion. More people died in 9/11, and it was an ongoing situation. But the death of Kennedy really was the harbinger of a complete shift, a paradigm shift in this culture. So, who did she say did it? Did she ever say? Did she ever really actually come out and say?
Yeah, and that's what I think has been an interesting part of the research is she likened that assassination to the film 7 Days in May, and that was about a political coup. Rod Serling did the manuscript for that. So, there are a lot of people in kind of the mob kill Kennedy camp, and I really feel like the evidence points more towards more government, CIA, kind of rogue government people. And I would think that Dorothy must have felt that way, or she would not have made that comment, and also been very publicly critical of LBJ. And, really,
Well, Allen Dulles hated Kennedy. Kennedy basically encouraged him to quit. He fired him. It got rid of him, right?
Yeah.
And Dulles was absolutely infuriated with him because Dulles was pivotal, like in the forefront leadership of the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy put a stop to air support for the Bay of Pigs, and Dulles never forgave him. And so as you well know, the implication is that this group of CIA operatives, boots on the ground, soldiers of fortune CIA guys who had been trained in assassinations and who were ruthless for political reasons, shifted. Bay of Pigs is not going to work. Well, we're going to go after the person who put the kibosh on our plan. And I think that they probably got quite a bit of support from Cuban emigres, expatriates, and they got support from what's his name, the mafia guy in New Orleans who was, or was it Miami, who was associated with Cuban, underworld. Traficante, yeah. And then the other guy in New Orleans was starts with a G. I can't remember. It's the first thing to go is names.
Yeah, and the New Orleans mafia don was Carlos Marcello. And you might be thinking of Giancana more.
Giancana is the one I was thinking of. Yes. I've got such a good memory. It's great. So let's see here. She said she told people it was the story of a lifetime and she was going to write a book and prove it.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like that was a chilling statement to make. She went after all those inconsistencies, witnesses who changed their story, witnesses who said one thing in the immediate aftermath, but then to the Warren Commission, they had a different story. Weird evidence that was manipulated or disappeared or wasn't consistent. The security. She had a lot to say about the Secret Service and the cops in Dallas. Mm-hmm. How much did she really know about the police chief in Dallas?
Well, Jesse Curry was the police chief, and I think she felt, well, in one of her columns, she wrote about how she had obtained police logs of, kind of car-to-car communication, and Curry had been in the pilot car, so in front of Kennedy and the rest of the procession, and had immediately said, we need to get people on the triple overpass and see what happened over, that area of the grassy knoll. And of course, he would later kind of change his story. So I think she felt like people were maybe pressured to adhere to the Oswald alone. Oswald did it, lone assassin. And maybe people felt a sort of patriotic duty to spare the public a more complex, potentially damning story that I don't necessarily think everyone was in on a giant conspiracy, but I think maybe if your boss's boss came to you and said, you really need to have a consensus here. We need to just have this one story. You need to get on board.
Well, am I remembering this correctly? Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it the Dallas police chief who got a call from LBJ that morning and told him to back off? Or am I conflating people?
Well, at least from what I remember, LBJ was very controlling of the autopsy. And of course, I highly recommend the documentary, What the Doctors Saw. I know it's streaming on Paramount Plus. A lot of what I quote from it is certainly a lot of what the doctors said about, the intimidation and getting that body out of there as quickly as they could. And, taking it to Bethesda, which was not really a skilled place. The doctors in Dallas were trauma informed. They dealt with car accident, gunshot wound victims.
Yeah.
It would have made sense to keep things there. And I think, again, what supports, my thesis about the government having involvement, mobsters aren't going to be able to pull all of those strings. The Secret Service swept in, and here we go. And certainly you would be under threat of court-martial if you didn't go along with, here we go.
Yeah, you're talking about the military, and the government is directly in charge of that. And they assigned 2 doctors to do an autopsy in Bethesda who are completely not forensic coroners. They're not pathologists. That's not their forte. The part of the story that I just found really mind-boggling was the story about the funeral director who did reconstructive work, who was brought in, flown to Virginia, came home the next day after being out of touch with everybody, and fled with his family, acting extremely suspiciously and paranoid for a period of time. And then as soon as Oswald was shot, he went, "Oh, the coast is clear. We can go home now." Am I describing that fairly accurately?
Yes. It's quite chilling to think about just people who were drawn into this kind of inadvertently and would later fear for their lives or felt like they could not step out of line and talk too much.
Now, isn't he the one who returned to Dallas, eventually moved his family to some gigantic house, had a lot of money, quit his job, had a lot of money, and ended up killing somebody later on, didn't he? Am I imagining that? Or?
Yeah, no, it's a wild story.
It's insane.
For sure. And I think it's all these things taken together, right?
Yes.
That lead a lot of us to feel like this is a conspiracy. More than 2 people were involved in this.
Yes, it's a giant puzzle.
Right.
When you put all the pieces together, there's no consistency in the official story and then all the pieces. It's like doing a puzzle, and the picture on the box is completely different from the pieces that you've got laid in front of you. It's just mind-boggling. And the interesting thing about that guy, just to refresh people's memory, is he was a reconstructive funeral guy. I don't even know the term. And he would come in when people were really, when their bodies, it's gross, but when their bodies were damaged from an accident or gunshot, and he would try to reestablish some sort of normalcy in their appearance for the benefit of funerals. But the implication here is, or the insinuation here is, that he was brought in to hide that huge exit wound.
Well, and who would have recruited him?
Yeah. It's just unbelievable. Yeah.
Obviously someone with government clearance or Secret Service would have approached him. I know it's kind of wild to be like Lyndon Johnson could have been behind the assassination, but it just, so many things lead to, as I named one of my chapters, a grand design. And that's kind of how I felt like it had played out. I mean, think about even at Parkland Hospital when the doctors were giving a press conference, not all that long after, maybe a few hours. And, they were told afterwards not to talk about a wound from the front. And, very intimidated by this. And, it just kind of begs the question, how was the official story already concluded in just a matter of a few hours? They had everything figured out, case closed.
Yes.
So this points to just from the second Kennedy was assassinated, there were plans in place to create an official line.
Yeah. The narrative was written before the event ever occurred. The lone gunman, the kind of lunatic lone wolf, probably is, he was in Russia, he's not to be trusted. And so we could write the whole thing off. And what they did with his wife was so cynical. Years later, she was horrified to discover that they completely mistranslated everything that she said, and the doctors who didn't speak after the initial telling of what they saw, being reprimanded about it and threatened, they didn't speak about it again until they were dying, most of them, until really, really recently. It's shocking. And freedom of information has allowed people to get access to some of the stuff that was kept secret from the public for a long time. I have a big question here about her life being threatened, Dorothy Kilgallen's life being threatened because of the noise that she was making around the Kennedy assassination. And so I have a really easy question for you. Who? Who threatened her?
Sure. And, well, were you at some point wanting to delve into Ron Pataki a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Oh. Yeah. This is a crazy story. It's just every time you think you're on, you have a thread, you get a few more that fall. Did you feel that way when you were writing the book? That's why I so admire the work that you did, because it's organized and it's clear, and yet I couldn't synopsize it easily enough. I had to set some things aside and say, we'll talk about Marilyn at a different date, because it's just so much. So some of the questions I had really quickly, because I know you want to get to him, and he really is one of the major pivotal characters in this narrative. But some of the things that jumped out at me, Oswald claimed he was a patsy. Ruby claimed he was a scapegoat. I believe that neither one of them were fully aware of what they were involved in until it was too late. What would you think about that?
I think I'm definitely of the mindset that Oswald was likely government intelligence, that he actually worked for the government. And I think he was very blindsided by being fingered for this crime.
Yeah.
And, Jack Ruby obviously had underworld connections. So there are some mob angles you could work on this story. But, just in some research I did, it was not totally clear, but it did appear that during that time in the 60s, Texas law was such that crimes of passion really were kind of a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if Ruby had been kind of coerced into, well, hey, you'll be a hero if you kill Oswald. And we'll get you out. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
It certainly won't be the death penalty. I mean, I can't imagine he was on board for this, thinking his life could possibly be on the line.
Wasn't he he hinted he was promised money. He was promised, this will turn out in your favor. Yeah.
I mean, he certainly said things that were very cryptic, and of course his defense team had wanted to plead that insanity. This was all just for the moment shooting Oswald, and certainly evidence points to this being a premeditated crime. I mean, he was stalking Oswald.
So there was a doctor, Lewis West, who was actually part of the MK Ultra thing, which always immediately when you say that, people go, oh, come on, conspiracy theory. It's actually a true thing. There's evidence of it now. But they were the ones who were experimenting with LSD and experimenting with mind control. And he was the psychiatrist who worked with Ruby in his jail cell and shortly thereafter, Ruby died, you know, and he also worked with Saran. So I think that
It's odd.
kind of deserves to be looked at a little bit. And then who was the guy? I wrote it down here. I don't want to take time hunting for it. The guy who said, I believe that after Ruby was interviewed by Dorothy the first time, that they started to poison him, that he didn't really die of cancer. He was murdered, you know, allegedly.
Yeah, I think there's definitely theories out there that he could have even been injected with cancer cells. You know, really, you know, there was really a sharp decline in his health. I mean, I certainly don't know that for a fact, but it's kind of chilling to think that that might have happened.
Yeah. How sad is it that I don't find it the least bit surprising? It doesn't. So then, you know, Oswald and Tippett and the theater scenario. Who was Oswald waiting to meet? Why was he there? What was he told? Because obviously he wasn't told the real story. And who sent Tippett to shoot him? Because I think that's what was going on there. I think Tippett was supposed to kill Oswald and clean up the evidence, right? And then Tippett would be killed, and then it would nobody would carry on the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely evidence that you could push forward that Tippett was involved in the plot to kill Kennedy, and then he himself. You know, if I could just sidestep a moment, you know, Dorothy wrote a column where she interviewed Aquila Clements. Now, she was not named, but we feel like today that's who it was. And she was an African-American woman who lived in that neighborhood where Tippett was shot. And she witnessed the crime, and it was not someone who fit Oswald's description. It was actually the man she saw.
Yeah.
You know, but she was old and I think diabetic, so she was not considered a credible witness by the Warren Commission.
Yeah. Well, this is a perfect example. We could sit here all day with story after story, eyewitness report evidence that could be questioned, that's dubious, that challenges the mainstream narrative. It's absolutely fascinating. For example, Mary Pinchot Meyer, her husband was Cord Meyer, and he was involved in the whole Watergate thing, right? Am I imagining that?
You know, he was a high-ranking CIA official, and I think he could have been involved with the plot to kill Kennedy. I guess to get back to your question, I know you'd ask who was Oswald meeting, and I think it could have been the man that we always have trouble pronouncing his name, George de Mohrenschildt.
Oh, Mohrenschildt, yeah.
You know, for people who don't believe in a conspiracy, there's just too many coincidences. You know, why would there be all these connections? You know, if it's not leading to a bigger.
Yeah, well, coincidences and contradictions, outright lies that can be proven. More information is available today than was 40 or 50 years ago because of freedom of information, and time has gone by. But, you know, in the 70s, they did that investigation into assassination group, you know, what was it called? I can't remember now the name of the guy that it was named after. And they pretty much came out and said, yeah, you know, this was a conspiracy, and the Warren Commission, we don't know what they were up to, but they were not accurate. And it was just a really interesting sort of coda to the story. And I think it happened just long enough after that people had moved on. And it was easier to convince people that it was all imaginary, you know, to think it was a conspiracy. So let me get to the part where Dorothy, the subject of this conversation, it's just crazy. So she goes to work one night. She records What's My Line. She goes out with her producer for a drink, which was common. They did this often. She tells him, I have a late date. Mm-hmm. It was kind of a well-known secret that she had dates with people despite being married, and didn't say who it was, and did come home with some man because the butler and the wife heard a man in the house with her, but it was huge. It was a 5-story, gigantic building close to Central Park. Very, very impressive. And they find her dead the next day in a bed that she usually didn't sleep in. Full stage makeup and eyelashes from the night before, which she wouldn't have done. She was sort of fastidious about her appearance. And then this unbelievably inconsistent, contradictory story about when she was found, who found her, who was notified, when they were notified. The police didn't hear about it potentially until late in the afternoon. So can you kind of run through that? Your grasp of it is going to be far better than mine. So if you could.
Yeah. Did you want to start with that mystery man with Pataki, or just kind
Yeah,
of
you tell it the way that you feel like it's the clearest, because I'm just overwhelmed with the deluge of information. Yeah.
It is. When people ask me about my book, I really don't always know where to start, because
Exactly.
it's offshoot so many places. But I think, as we've been talking, it might be a good time to talk about Ron Pataki.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us feel like that was the man that she met, at the Regency bar that night before she died, and perhaps had been involved in her death. And they had met in June of 1964. So kind of at the height of Dorothy's investigation and column writing about the assassination. So just the time frame in which he entered the scene, I think, is a bit suspect. They met in Europe on a press junket for The Sound of Music. And to take this back a little bit, Ron Pataki was an entertainment reporter for the Columbus Citizen Journal. And of course, Columbus, Ohio is a medium-sized city. I mean, it's not New York City or Los Angeles. But he seemed so well connected. He was always traveling. He was covering all of these movie premieres and theatrical debuts. Knew a lot of Hollywood people, knew mobsters, knew Pat Lawford, knew the Kennedys. How are you so well connected?
Yeah. How did he know them? I mean, that's insane.
Yes. And really, how this had begun is in Lee Israel's book, which came out in the late 1970s, called Kilgallen. She only referred to him as the out-of-towner, I think maybe fearing some kind of libelous concerns. And it was my Midwest Today article, Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen, that named Pataki for the first time. And I had a researcher by the name of Catherine Fauble, who was very helpful then, and really as I wrote my book, just kind of an amateur sleuth fan. And it was actually her and David Henschel that recorded those interviews with the hairdressers. And it was my article that put that out to the public for the first time. So they really conducted their own investigation, really. And
As
so
some of the first investigations of some of the events around her death had not been investigated at all.
Yeah, the police weren't terribly interested. So it took, I guess you would say, fans or concerned citizens to get involved and do that. And so I mentioned Catherine because she actually helped our publication, my father and I, get connected with Pataki in that early time of writing the article. We literally went on an online forum on the Game Show Network saying that I was doing this article looking for leads. And my father cultivated probably a 10-year relationship with Ron Pataki, phone call, email, that no other author has done. Pataki certainly was not a fan of anyone else who reached out to him to be interviewed, because I think they took an antagonistic approach to him. Certainly, I think you killed Dorothy, and I'm going to prove it. Where I think we wanted to make him think that, we could be, trusted. We're not out to get him. We're certainly seeking the truth. And again, I kind of bring this up at this juncture because my father did dozens and dozens of interviews with Pataki, just reams of tape, and had wanted to handle those interviews because I was in my teens at this time.
Yeah, he wanted to be a buffer. Yeah, because
Yeah,
this guy's suspect.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But they're both journalists talking shop. The old movies. People that Pataki knew, the pop culture angle. And I think it was a bit of a loosening of lips at one point when Pataki said that he was in Guatemala in the summer of 1954.
Oh, talk more about that, because that blew my mind.
And involved in quote, a small military operation.
Yeah.
And really at that time, I think it just kind of flew right over us. But certainly going through the process of putting the book together, I revisited that and I felt like there was not a military operation. It was a paramilitary, and it was a CIA-backed coup.
It was, yeah, it was
So a little
basically an
different.
overthrowing of the government. Yeah. Yeah.
And at the time, Pataki was a student at Stanford University. And as we later know, that had been a hub of CIA activity, recruitment projects. There was not even a very clear divide of what was school funded, what was CIA funded. So there he is. And I even have his school transcripts. That was very helpful to get a hold of that. Not a terribly ambitious student, but fluent in Spanish and was interested in foreign service. And then when he's expelled, about that May, June time frame in school, I think he was recruited to go to Guatemala
By the CIA.
Just based on his profile, what was known of his abilities and interests. And I think Pataki was maybe in his later life, he's since passed away, but I think when he and my father were talking, he maybe felt like, I could probably slip some of this information out. I don't think they're going to do anything with it. And of course, what would happen? I mean, it's not like we would have gone to the local police, sheriff or deputy and said, this man confessed to being involved in a political coup in another country. I mean, they would say,
so,
I mean, or government or yeah, it's not like there would be ramifications or, you'd have impunity if you were involved in things that were sanctioned by the government. And so I think when Pataki then became a newspaper journalist, I think he had a supplementary income or a budget to go to the West Coast and befriend all these people.
Travel.
Hobnob. Because being a journalist myself, newspapers and magazines, there's not a budget for anything really. Times have changed certainly, but even going back to the 50s and 60s, I don't understand that. And Pataki was with the Scripps Howard Syndicate. And, if you know anything about how syndicates work, you're paying membership or your papers are owned by a certain entity to share stories, what would say go over the wire. And back in Dorothy's day, it was a teletype machine. It would literally come over
a wire, right?
So, and the beauty of that was, if there's a volcano eruption in Hawaii, there'd be someone in Honolulu that wrote the story and send it to
a stringer for the the AP or the UP or whoever, right?
Positioned all over the globe, really. So why would Pataki be sent? Wouldn't Scripps Howard have had reporters in New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco to cover those plays, cover those movies, and then you'd slip it in the paper, next day or whatever? Why always send him? And maybe the answer is he had a budget on his own to go, and they said sure. It just seemed very odd to me because I know he was not syndicated. At least outside of his stories running in papers in Ohio. Certainly not like Dorothy. You can't find him in papers outside of Ohio. So where is the incentive to send him all over? I mean, the Sound of Music press junket was in London and Vienna and all of those places.
It was a big deal. Yeah.
Where's the budget? And certainly without being syndicated, it was just going to run in Columbus, maybe a couple of outliers. So to me, that points to, I think he was on the CIA payroll, and I think he entered Dorothy's life in the summer of '64 to be a paid informant.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, right? Well, look at what happened when he was young. Didn't he sort of disappear off the radar for a year? And the speculation is that he was at that CIA assassin training camp. And I've heard rumors of this from other sources in relationship to the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs. There's a connection there. Disaffected, trained CIA paramilitary guys.
Yes.
Yeah. And he was one of them, basically, is what you kind of came out with, right?
Yeah, the School of the Assassins. And that had been kind of a controversial claim. I know Lee Israel was, we consulted her when that article originally came out, and she was quite a fireball. She was definitely a very interesting lady. And she was not really pleased with putting that theory out. I think she was kind of concerned to say things about Pataki that were potentially threatening in that way. And I think certainly these things were true. I don't know totally why she was kind of hesitant, but you know,
I think it's pretty clear. I mean, there's a string of dead bodies.
Convenient,
you know, from November of '63 onward. I could see where people would be uncomfortable. At this point, no, but a while ago, perhaps. And if you came from that time period and you were in journalism at that time period and investigating things, that paranoia probably lingered. It probably was something that haunted you. Yeah. Mind-blowing. So basically he was a gigolo plant. You know, he was
yeah. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. Yes, and of course, think about her affair with Johnny Ray. He was much younger than her, about 14, 15 years younger.
Yep.
So I could see someone at the top. I don't know personally who it was, of course, but someone, you know, higher up in government intelligence may have thought, well, we have Pataki. We know him. We've known him since the coup. Perhaps that's someone we could put in Dorothy's life. We know she likes younger men. He's a journalist. That's something maybe they could hit it off, you know, with that connection. And let's see what he finds out. You know, what is she researching? Who is she suspicious of? Where is she getting her material? Certainly when she got the parts of the Warren Commission and published them in the Journal American, Jack Ruby's testimony. I'm sure that was a moment of concern for the government. I mean, it launched a federal investigation and she refused to tell who that leak was. I mean, it's still not totally clear how she obtained all of that.
Oh, well, John Daly's daughter-in-law.
I know a lot of people are suspicious of John Daly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily germane to the whole bigger picture of naming who this person is, but I think at the very least, Ron Pataki was put in her life for a reason. And again, I come back to the hairdressers, Mark Sinclair and Charles Simpson. Like I said, were interviewed extensively for those videotaped interviews that have been very helpful for researchers since. And Sinclair felt like as he was doing her hair that final evening before the last show, that you know, she was a bit withdrawn, you know, something was on her mind. Unfortunately, it wasn't really clear as to the exact threat she was receiving. I felt like there was maybe a little bit of a missed opportunity during those interviews to kind of probe deeper into what she was fearful of or specifics. Those are a little unknown. But Sinclair pretty much said, there's only one new person in your life right now. That's Ron Pataki. Maybe.
Yeah, she was afraid for her life and wanted to get a gun. And didn't she basically tell her, like maybe not in so many words, that it was him?
Followed, receiving threatening mail. And of course, this is according to Mark Sinclair, you know, him saying, you should talk to Ron Pataki. And of course, he left. And then when he saw her that final night on the show, she had changed her outfit. She was wearing a little bit more of a cocktail going out, you know, to see your boyfriend kind of thing. And he just remembered, you know, the hair didn't fit. You know, he's a hairdresser. He's looking at
she needed more of an updo.
Something motivated this.
Yeah.
And again, I'm speculating here, but I think perhaps after Mark Sinclair left her home, Dorothy called Ron and said, "I'm upset. I need to talk. Can you get the next flight
Yeah,
out?"
and that was his alibi, that he was in Ohio, right?
Yeah, and of course, I did the math, and I'm not a mathematician, but I did the math, and certainly by the time What's My Line got out, and after she had that quick drink at
Yeah,
PJ,
killed some time at the bar, right?
I think it's theoretically possible that Pataki could have flown there, taken a taxi, met her at the Regency. And I think it's another example of a missed opportunity that couldn't the police have done a sketch artist? There were certainly witnesses. I mean, the bar was kind of dark. I mean, people weren't approaching her that intimately, but circulate his photo, to the bartender, to the pianist, to
I don't remember the specifics, but I do vaguely remember, because there's just so much here, but that there was something hinky about the New York police, like they were somebody in charge was associated with questionable characters who might have had that kind of government power. Really a lot of really strange associations and people in positions to make investigations stop, who knew somebody or who was related to somebody. It's just bizarre, really, really astounding. So it's never been resolved. It's the great mystery, Here's a question for you. And this might be impossible to answer because this book is so dense with information, but what was the one thing, or maybe a couple of things, that you discovered or uncovered that really shocked you or surprised you, took you aback?
About Dorothy specifically, do you think? Or?
Just in researching the book, whatever, carte blanche, whatever.
I mean, I had certainly grown up feeling like there was a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. My father has been researching the case for 50 years. So certainly, I chat with him about, what do you think, should I include this? Kind of helping with some of that research, certainly, and so much of that, the two caskets. I mean, I don't even know where to start on that craziness.
Oh, well, see, there's an example. There's just so much.
I feel like Parkland Hospital is obviously a great starting point in terms of the forensics. What happened there, what they witnessed. And of course, this would be pretty trauma imprinted. I always like when people go, well, the doctors were mistaken. There was no front head wound. They're just mistaken. All right.
Yeah, like the day that they bring the president in with half his head blown off, you're going to just sort of forget about it, right?
Yeah, and even they had said it's so, really, I would say trauma, right? I mean, trauma is going to stay with you.
Absolutely.
Going to be, and the room, I going back to your question, that room, trauma room 1 was where Kennedy was, and of course Connolly in trauma room 2. Just the size of kind of maybe the entryway to your home. I mean, just like a little small bathroom kind of size. I would think you'd have a pretty clear view and know who was where and what was going on. And
an ER exam room, it's nothing. It's not a lot of space. Yeah.
So, maybe that would answer the question in terms of, this had begun so early on, this cover up and the official line of the story. And I think the Parkland doctors did not have a political agenda. They didn't have reason to put forth ideas. That I think they were just following the evidence, and it begins that early on in the story. I think you can't just discard what they are putting forth as what they think happened. And certainly, the CIA stuff. I mean, Frank Sturgis had said that Dorothy got whacked. That's a comment he'd made. He's one of the Watergate burglars. And I think we know so much about E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and Cord Meyer and James Jesus Angleton, do we trust what they're saying? I mean, in terms of, they weren't nothing to see here. I mean, do we?
Well, I don't know how you feel. I don't.
Like, there's no motivation to suppress evidence or to lie. And if I could go here for a moment, you know, when Kennedy died, Dorothy, you know, she was Irish Catholic. This was our first Catholic president. You know, she'd met him and, you know, with her son Carrie, you know, the year before. The columns were very sentimental. They were very, you know, and Jackie, she's just, you know, so classy. She's so elegant. You know, this family has been to hell and back. And then the moment that Ruby shot Oswald, of course, that wasn't a long time afterwards, granted. The tone, there's a great shift in the tone of those columns. They're accusatory,
Angry,
antagonistic. You could certainly say antagonistic, a little taunting at times, because I think she felt like with Oswald gone, there's no due process. There's not a trial. You know, she covered enough trials, right? That she said you would get to know the character of the victim as you got through over the course of a trial. And I think she and most people were hoping for answers. You know, it just seemed, what? Who's that? You know, Oswald, who is Oswald? And certainly the government was controlling that narrative. And I think she felt like a trial would have presented the opportunity to learn more.
and the facts out.
And then, of course, I think that was a big reason she set off to Dallas to cover Ruby's trial. You know, that was going to be kind of the second best source of information to kind of glean more insights into all of this.
Yeah, I got the impression that the anger took over, the frustration and the anger, and then the intellectual curiosity as well, the sense of justice, right and wrong. I think she probably had a pretty fine-tuned sense of that in general. There was a question that I wanted to ask you. What was it? Well, it's gone now. It's okay. I do have another question for you. What's your next book?
Oh, gosh, you know, I don't have one in mind. You know, I do so much feature writing and news writing. I do some book editing. I don't have anything major in mind. I'm definitely a big lover of American pop culture, everyday life, you know, social history. Always kind of had an interest in disco. I thought that might be an interesting topic to pursue. Music.
I have a suggestion. Now, this is not somebody that I wouldn't recognize that person's voice if I heard it. It's more of my kids, you know, era. But I've read a lot about this, and I just get the same creepy feeling about this as I did about Dorothy Kilgallen. Kurt Cobain.
Oh.
You don't know about that controversy?
Well, I mean, if you think that's something worth pursuing, yeah, feel free to tell me more.
Well, I'm not going to talk about it on a recording because a lot of the people that we would be talking about might take exception to it, but I'll fill you in here in a minute. And yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, you know, but it's a thought. Now, like I said, I wouldn't recognize his music if I heard it, but the story that I heard is very interesting. So I'll tell you in a minute. So yeah, I strongly encourage you to write another book because I loved your book. And if the reception that I got, just even getting only halfway through it so far, I'll be uploading this by the time I've completely covered the book. But we're talking about halfway through here because this is when you were available. And people were just crazy about it. People kept messaging me. I can't wait till next weekend for the next installment of the book. You know, so I would so much encourage everybody to go buy this book. I have been forced, as you can tell by the degree of research and the level of factual information here, I've been forced to gloss over some of the parts of the book because it's just, we'd be here for weeks and weeks if we were going to cover the whole thing in detail. So I really recommend it. It's well written. It's just a gripping book, really interesting. You did a masterful job of a really complicated story and multiple complicated stories, I might add.
Yeah.
And I just feel like I know Dorothy Kilgallen now from your writing, and have such respect for her as a journalist and a woman at a difficult time for women. And I just want to thank you for doing such a great job.
Oh, I'm just so flattered. I had no idea you would spend this much time on my book. I mean, I'm kind of overwhelmed slash kind of mortified, honestly. I'm just so
Oh
overwhelmed.
no, it's wonderful. Well, I'm a little obsessive, so take it with a block of salt, you know. But when it comes to books, if I like a book, hard pressed to shut me up about it. So, no, I just thank you so much. I just loved it, and I know that a lot of people felt the same way because I've heard from them, and they were just, oh, this is fabulous, and I didn't know. And so you have to write another book, and you have to write it soon because I'm almost finished the other book I'm reading, and I need something new. And tell your father to get to work. I'm going to be watching for his book.
Yeah.
And you'll have to put in a good word for us and have him come talk to us about Marilyn, because I know that'll be popular too. So did we cover everything? Is there anything that I just absolutely left out that you want to be sure to mention?
Well, I just want to take the opportunity to kind of revisit, you know, originally when I was planned to write this book, my father and I were going to do one big book called Silence, and it was going to be kind of a dual storyline between Marilyn and Dorothy. And then of course we found like that was going to be way too convoluted, and decided to do the split there. And I mean, I'm certainly very glad we did. I tried to find a lot of Dorothy's columns. I definitely think previous authors have not delved into her columns as much as I have. You know, I kind of would read the same things over and over, but then when you went to the direct source, so much more color, so much more rich. And I definitely encourage people to pick up my book, even if you've read the other books on Dorothy. I know there's one author who's been quite prolific with writing books. I do know him personally, actually. He's come, you know, to me for some information for sources and stuff. And when he found out I was doing my own book, ceased communicating with me. So that is the story there. And I feel like certainly with the information I have on Pataki and just kind of the newly declassified documents, that it's definitely worth your time to see what I have and you know, draw your own conclusions of what book on Dorothy that you have enjoyed the most.
Well, you know, I haven't been to medical school. I'm certainly not a psychiatrist. But when I read that poem that he wrote after her death, I diagnosed him immediately. What a psychopath.
Yes, I know what you're referring to. And that's the thing too with, you know, my initial article certainly hinted at him being involved with her death, and yet he would still call up our publication and be very friendly and used to ask about me and what I was doing in school and where I lived and was asking personal questions, and you just had to wonder, was he just super nice and totally okay talking to people who thought he was a murderer, or was this a bit of an act? Was this, I should keep the Jordans close because they know stuff?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I have a really good alarm system about people. And as soon as I started reading about him, I thought, oh my God, this guy is just disturbed bad news, not a good character. Yeah, I'm glad your father provided a buffer, because I think that is actually a potentially threatening situation for you. And he's dead now, so we can relax.
Yeah.
But
yeah. And honestly, it does seem a bit shocking that it took Dorothy some time to see through his facade. I mean, that is a bit surprising to me, right? That she even let Pataki into her life.
Psychopaths are master manipulators and very charming. You know, if you really spend time with them, you begin to get that kind of icky feeling, you know, but no, they fool a lot of people. I mean, look at all the famous serial killers who aren't complete lunatics, who pass themselves off as, you know, charming the one that comes to mind is the guy in Chicago, the doctor who had the big hotel that he ran during the World's Fair in Chicago, and he was killing people right and left, and everyone thought he was really charming. He had a pharmacy on the bottom floor, you know, and he was okay. thank you so much. Don't go away. I want to talk to you for just a second after we end this, but I just want to thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's been fascinating. I suspect we could talk another 4 hours. Thank you to everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and go out and buy this wonderful book, The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen by Sara Jordan Heintz. Sara, thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Oh, thanks so much, Helen. You're great.
Song Gafoil, everybody. Sláinte.